sunshine. I realize I am in sunshine. The skies are turning blue. Would you like...
All right, welcome to another episode of Accept Truth with Joy. I'm really happy to be here with Byron Adams. We're actually in his office, and we're going to have a little chat today about science and religion and some of these points that this channel is all about. So, Byron, thanks for being here with me.
Sure, happy to do it, Heath.
All right. I wanted to start with you kind of telling a little bit about yourself. I actually don't know much about you before you came to BYU, so maybe you could just give me a brief history of like where you grew up and kind of where you were growing up.
Sure. I grew up in Susanville, California, which is up in the northeast part. It's a beautiful little town, tiny place though, middle of nowhere. We had a small farm with cows, chickens, goats, like everything. And it was a place where I was just immersed in nature, in the natural world all the time.
Mm-hmm.
In the mountains, canyons, rivers, streams. And so like biology was just everywhere around me. And I just like that was like where all of my interests were. So
And this is what you wanted to do from a little kid?
Yeah, I think
then?
from the time I was a little kid, like, and you know, my parents nurtured that, my teachers, you know, even though I was like a super weird kid, like my teachers, you know, made me feel like, hey, that's cool, you know, that's all right. And so I grew up in that town. Then I went to BYU. Like I did have an academic scholarship to come here, but mostly I was just interested in girls and football.
What year was this, more or less?
So this was 1984,
okay.
My freshman year. Oh man, now everybody knows how old I am.
Oh yeah, that's okay.
and so I took lots of classes, like just bombed in school, right? Because I was just goofing around all the time. I shouldn't say bombed. Like I learned a lot. I learned some. I grew up a lot. And then I had made I walked onto the football team and I made the team, and so I decided that well, I don't want to be a missionary now, right? Because like I'm on the football team, I want to play football, you know. But that didn't sit well, right? I just in the back of my mind, I just knew that being a missionary was what I should be doing. And like my family was totally cool. Nobody asked me about it. There's no pressure. But I sort of just tried to, I was running from the idea that I should be a missionary. And eventually I just couldn't do it anymore. And so I pretty much quit the team, went on a mission. And that completely changed everything about me. At least most all the negative things about me. Like prior to that, I was pretty arrogant, self-absorbed. I was the awesomest dude in the world kind of attitude. And then I served in Dallas, Texas with Laotian refugees. So I had to learn how to speak Lao and translate and do tons of service kinds of stuff with these people. And I came to really love them. And forgetting about yourself and making everything about somebody else, some other people, completely changed who I wanted to be and how I wanted to roll. And I'm still trying to not be an arrogant jerk like I was, but I mean that was momentous for me. They completely changed. And so after that, I lost 35 pounds, but I also lost all of my desire to play football anymore. I really wanted to be a part of the world of ideas. I really wanted, there was something, pushing me in a completely different direction. And so then I came back to BYU, still had crappy grades for the most part. But by the time I was a junior or senior, I decided that I was no longer interested in going to med school and no longer interested in good grades. And that's actually when my grades went up. I ended up getting really good grades once I quit caring about my grades, right? And I got super interested in doing research. I did research with some of the professors here at BYU, and that launched me into graduate school. And so I went to graduate school at the University of Nebraska.
Okay.
I got married to Marcy first, and she was a herpetologist. She'd been working with jacksites here at BYU, wanted to do herpetology. And I'd been working with Merritt Kalashevsky and Lee Braithwaite, doing invertebrates, mostly marine invertebrates. And we were looking for grad schools. It's not a grad school where they do marine biology and herpetology, right? Nothing like that. And So we ended up at the University of Nebraska, which was like this fantastic place for herpetology, right? Marcy was doing behavioral ecology. They had a big behavioral ecology group there, and so that's how we ended up at Nebraska. And I ended up in a lab that was like, there's the lab, dude, have fun. And it was so liberating for me to just go into the lab and like, really, I can do anything I want, you know, like, so that's where I got my PhD. And then
And what was that? What was it? Was that in nematodes? Is that where you started?
that's where I
nematology?
first started. I actually first started working in herpetology also, right?
Oh, okay.
There's this guy across the hall worked on frogs, and he was John Lynch. He's like super like famous guy in herpetology in terms of like biogeography and evolution, phylogenetics, you know, and I really liked that work, but this other lab had nematodes, and anyway, there was a really cool study system that I could do in this other lab. You can smash those things and get DNA from them. Nobody cares about it, right? Like, you're not working with vertebrates where like the PETA people are going to be all upset if you're killing frogs and stuff. So for me, it was just like, wow, that's way easier. Like, I can grow thousands of these things. I can smash them all up. I can extract DNA. I can sequence them. And so like that's how I got into the working with the nematodes. And yeah, and then after we graduated there, I did a postdoc at UC Davis out in California. That was a great time. And then I was there just a short time before I got my first like real job, you know, at the University of Florida. So I was a professor at the University of Florida for a while, and I loved Florida. That was a great place for us, but we really missed our family out in the West. Marcy and I are both from California, and Utah was like a day's drive from family, so that got us a lot closer. And like, I absolutely love it. It's like, since I've been here, it's like an amazing gig.
So did BYU kind of look for you, or did you see a position and applied? Or
A little bit of both.
Yeah.
Like, I had stayed in contact. Like, there were faculty here that every now and then send me a Christmas card saying, "Hey, where you at? You know, like, where you at with the postdoc? When are you looking for a job?" You know, that kind of thing. So I was on their radar screen. Yeah. And then I got a call, from somebody in MM Bio department. So Keith Crandall, when he was in both departments, biology and MM Bio.
Yeah.
And he sent me an email saying, "Hey, there's this position that we're looking to fill. You'd be a good fit. You should look into it." You know, so I applied. And
yeah, because I remember you started here when? What year was it?
2003.
Yeah, so you started when I was a PhD student.
Right, you were just finishing up.
I was just about ready to finish up.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I do remember that.
that's right.
Yeah, because like my office was right across from your lab.
Yeah, we were right there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. And growing up, you were like kind of true blue Mormon kind of the whole time, or
but
was your family a little bit different?
They were very, very Mormon, but I would say like doctrinally Mormon and not so much culturally Mormon.
Okay.
So, my dad was a convert to the church when he was a little bit older, married my mom, who had been previously married. So I have 3 older sisters from a previous marriage. So in some ways, like, we're not like the traditional like Mormon family.
Yeah.
But in other ways, like, we were very faithful. We went to church all the time, participated in all the activities. It was like, that was an important component of family life. But then, I learned once we moved to Utah, like once I came here to be an undergraduate, like, there's a huge difference between like the religion and the culture. And like, that was really hard for me. Like, I just pushed back really hard. So like I said, my freshman year here, I struggled. Living in Utah was just hard for me. Not that it's not beautiful, it's like gorgeous, right? That's not the hard part. The hard part was just, the culture was difficult for me. People would say things or judge me in certain ways, and I'd be like, that's not the way I was raised. Like, that's not part of my religion. You look it up. It's not in the book. So that was harder for me. And obviously, like, moving back here, that was something that we were concerned about. Like Marcy and I, when we left Utah, I remember us saying, "We're never coming back here again." And I remember we had this conversation. Can you imagine how hard it would be to raise your kids in Utah? Like, just imagine that, because she's also from California, so like, we both kind of struggled a little bit with the culture here. And, when we came back to Utah, that was like our number one thing. Like, are we going to be able to raise our kids here in a healthy way?
And how's that gone?
It's gutters and strikes, dudes. Like, some of our kids have thrived, and some of our other kids have really struggled. And it's, some of our kids are like, yeah, we get that.
And how many children do you
I
have?
have three.
Three, okay.
Yeah, so I use plural, so you don't know which ones I'm talking about. but yeah, it's been hard and good, right, for all of them. There's good and bad. But like when we were in Florida, we were weighing out this decision. We're like, no matter where you live, like in Florida, there were really ugly issues there. Like racism was like, bam, like in our face. Our kids, like, we would go to a restaurant and I would have to say, Ethan, what you just saw, not acceptable. Never say these words, never treat him like he's 5 years old,
Right.
And we're having these conversations like, yeah, that's an issue that we have. No matter where you live, there's always going to be something that you're just going to have to protect your kids against, right? You're just going to have to say, hey, this is what the culture is, but that's not us, and that's not how we roll. And so when we first moved to Utah, I had some neighbors down the street who were not Mormons, but they had kids the same age, and our kids were playing, and the father comes up to me, he's like, hey, are you guys all right for like letting the kids play together on Saturdays? And I was like, yeah, like, why not? And he's like, well, the last people that lived in your house there said Saturday was a special day to get ready for Sunday, and their kids couldn't like play on Saturday with our kids. And I was like, like, that's culture, that's not religion, and anyway, so
that's been you've had quite the journey then. So now you've been here then in Utah now for nearly 20 years.
Yeah,
right.
Like we've been here 18 years.
18 years, yeah. And I know that you're interested in kind of this topic of, science and science education and trying to, help the community and your students to become more science literate. What are you seeing in BYU, and what have you seen in the last 20 years here at BYU?
That's an interesting question, Heath. There's a couple of patterns that I've seen. And the first pattern is that content-wise, like general knowledge of science of our incoming students, is like they're getting stuff. Like they're getting like content types of knowledge. But and most of them don't have, some of the dysfunctional hang-ups with conflicts between science and religion like they used to. So for example, like evolution, for example, 20 years ago, far more students would enter my classes and be like, whoa, wait, evolution, like, wow. Whereas now, the vast majority of them like, yeah, we talked about it in church, we've talked about it in seminary, we've talked about it in high school, like, I'm good, let's go. Let's just get on to the just get on the science part of it. We don't need to talk so much about religion and stuff because like we've dealt with that. And so in that sense, like, that's been those are observations that are like really positive.
Did you struggle with evolution and religion?
No, I didn't. But remember that wasn't an issue for me. I grew up in California. Like my parents were like, yeah, like science is great. Like go for it, and like even my grandparents, like I would talk with them and they did not have a problem with evolution. That was all reconciled for them. It's like science, Heavenly Father works through, and science, these are things that should go like this. And so, my grandparents, like, they're horse and buggy age. Like my grandfather, grew up like in the early 1900s. Lived through all of those, lived through the, the 1910s, the 1920s when, like, the Scopes trial, he went through all, all of the very anti-evolution books that came out in the 50s and 60s from church leaders. And it was just like, not really a big deal.
Okay.
So.
And so you think that the BYU students coming in are probably more informed, and they're probably not having as big as issue with some of this, at least science and evolution stuff. What about the community at large? I mean, now that you've lived in Utah County, or whether that community is where you live or your ward or your stake, do you see what's your impressions about acceptance of science at that level?
Yeah, well, so I'm glad that you link these two together, because I would say that our students coming in, even though like content-wise, they're way ahead of the curve, like in terms of critical thinking and reasoning and ideology, they're not, right? And I think a lot of that has to do with the broader community, right? Where, in a science classroom, you can talk about critical thinking and reasoning and science and content, and they can get that sort of stuff, but they don't understand the distinction between like ideology versus science. They don't understand, how science works. And so you still have big issues with things like confirmation bias, right? And I think that that's something that you see in the broader community, this lack of ability to, it sounds like I'm making deprecating statements. I'm not, right? These are brilliant people, that super bright people. It's not that they're like, dumb or something, right? It's just that they, don't really have a good understanding of the process of science and how it works. How science itself is a self-correcting algorithm for getting at truth, right? So in terms of a way of knowing, like, it's a fantastic tool. And sometimes that is conflated with the religious beliefs as a way of knowing, right? And they either partition those two things out and never try and let their spiritual, that space that they've carved out for spirituality, they whenever it bumps up against the space that they've carved out for reason, like, that generates friction, and they don't like going into that space, for one. And then when it does, like, just this process of denialism kicks in. It's like, well, I know what I know about my testimony, or I know what I know about my religious beliefs. And if that science starts bumping into it and it's not aligning, then science must be bogus, right? Those guys must be wrong, right? They're making mistakes. And then they start to use these funky, right, narratives in order to justify that position, right? They start going down this path like, well, they used to say that the world was flat, now we know it's round. Or they used to say that, like, scientists got it wrong in the 50s, they're getting it wrong now. They don't understand that science is like the Final Four basketball tournament, where you start out with lots of ideas, right? And you just throw out all the bad ones, eventually you end up with the right one, right? You don't go backwards, right? You can't, right? You don't know less next year. You're not more wrong next year than you were this year, right?
I love that idea. I love that comparison with the basketball tournament, because I've seen this. Most of the ideas too that people get from science they're getting it at the very end after it's gone through this process, right? They're getting it from a textbook or whatever. But I found in this last year in particular, like with wearing masks, right? Like, this was an example where we didn't know very much about how masks were going to respond to this disease, this pandemic and other things. And the science was trying to figure things out, and it took a few months before they actually, and I thought it was actually a really good example for the general public of how science actually works.
Right.
But it was so interesting how many people were really uncomfortable with the kind of that gray area of not knowing. Like, they were uncomfortable with that, whereas in science, we deal with that all the time.
That's right. That's job security. Like, right, uncertainty is what keeps us employed. Like, dealing with that uncertainty is the exciting part of why we do what we do.
Yeah. So are there any other topics that, like, or things that you've seen maybe in the last few years or this last year even, where you've seen where people have struggled with this idea of how to be educated about, or how to be, how to have a really good conclusion about an idea? Do you have any other examples that you've seen?
Well, there's lots of examples, right? Like, so I have a research program in evolutionary biology, right, which historically has rubbed some folks wrong. And then I have a research program in climate change, right, science, which is more contemporary, rubbing people wrong. And I've seen, like, you name it, right? You can go from any sort of denialist movement, right, from denying the Holocaust to whatever it is, right? People roll in with their ideological background, and then they don't allow for space to understand the scientific process, or like how science works.
So how do you help, what can you do as an educator? So let's talk about, like, how do you help your students, and then we'll shift and talk about how can you help, like, community or your ward or something like that. So first, how do you help your students?
So for the longest time, I used to think that just in general, right, just fix the problem. Like, your problem is that you just don't know. Your problem is you just don't understand the content part of it. You just don't understand, like, how CO2 results in elevated temperatures or whatever, right? And so you spend all day talking to people about that. But, like, if they've already made up their mind that yeah, I'm not going to believe what you say anyway, because it contradicts what I hear on the talk show radio hosts, right? Or it contradicts, well, what I've heard is that there's other scientists that disagree with that. Well, it's like, okay, what we really need to be talking about is like the nature of science. Like, how does science work? And the people that you hear on the talk shows, like, what role are they playing? How much credibility do we give them, right? Like, where are they in terms of the playing field of science and scientists, right? So like often, like I'll start out with my students like saying, okay, here's how science works. Like, I'm a scientist. My job is to harsh on all the other scientists that are out there, right? You know this, right? When we get manuscripts to review, our job is to just beat the tar out of it. Like, we find every single error in there and we say, reject that manuscript, throw it in the trash. This is bad science, right? And then, that author, that scientist gets it back and like, oh, dang, man, like, I really do need to replicate this, or I really do need to redo this study, or I really do need to rethink my conclusions, right, or my analyses, right? And that's how science works. It's like the octagon. It's like a UFC fight championship ring, right? And you throw two ideas in the ring, and the one that has the support of the preponderance of the evidence stays in the ring. Yeah. Right? And the bad one, boom, it just get kicked out on the metal chairs, right? Yeah. And then the next one comes in. It's like that algorithm I was telling you about. It's like a tournament. Ideas keep coming in and they keep getting thrown out. And so when someone says, well, there's this senator from Oklahoma, or there's a scientist at Oklahoma who says that climate change isn't real because of X, Y, or Z, I'll say, like, great, throw that idea in the ring. Let's see what happens to it. And all they can respond is like, wow, it's some kind of conspiracy, right. Like, I'm on the fringes, they don't like me. And that's like, no, dude, that's not how it works. You've been to UFC. They don't care what color you are, or how big you are, or where you grew up, or where you trained. Nobody cares about that. Yeah. It's like, you get in the ring, you do your thing. And like a scientist, you get in the ring, you bring your data. Right? If you have the best data, if you have the best analyses, if your conclusions logically follow from your data and your analyses, you're staying in the ring, right? And there's a reason that all the rest of the scientists are like, like when we see that guy's ideas, is because like they're bogus, they're hokum. And those ideas might be really popular with someone who has some preconceived notions about how the world should work, right? If you have a preconceived notion that climate change is some kind of conspiracy, then you're going to be like, whoa, well, I'm looking for someone who's going to support my ideas. So let me find this one guy, in Oklahoma who has whose scientific ideals line up with mine. I'm like, whoa. Yeah, let's stop the show right now. Think about what we're doing here, right? That's not how science works.
Interesting.
Right?
I love those ideas. I remember being a new PhD student, and I was actually I felt scared and empowered. Scared because I remember going to the very first kind of meeting where there was all of the other world experts in mayflies, right? Who'd been looking at mayflies for 30 or 40 or 50 years in some cases. And I show up, this little PhD student, and I'm doing this new fanangled molecular phylogeny, and I basically say, here's the phylogeny, and I was going against a lot of these ideas that have been around for a long, long time. And I remember I could audibly in the back hear people saying, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Like, he hasn't looked at this long enough. And so it was humbling. And I remember talking to Dr. Whiting about this, and he says, you have just as much right to say whatever you want to say, and because it's the data, it's not me. Yeah. It's let the data fight it out. Let the evidence fight it out. And I just love that idea because I got empowered. Now I always share that with even my undergraduate students. Now I'm like, you can publish a paper. You can publish a paper just like anyone else can, because it's about the marketplace of ideas. And the best ideas with the best data are the ones that are going to survive.
Yeah. But think about how hard it is to get your students or like your family members or your ward members to sort of embrace that idea, because ideology, the baggage that we bring to our lives with other ways of knowing, right? You need to, we have to convey this idea of the explanatory power of science, and at the same time say this has nothing to do with your ideology. Nothing that's going on in science, right, in any way should influence like what's going on in your spiritual space in your life, right? That's a totally different way of knowing things. And you need to be able to embrace the two and reconcile the two. And that's the hardest thing for me to somehow get across to people, is that you can create space for that, and that friction can be really healthy. In fact, right, I would argue that provides both of those spaces a lot more meaning in your life, right? Like that allows that spiritual space to be much more meaningful, right? And it allows your science or your reason, right? Your space for logic and reason is that much more like valuable, fulfilling, meaningful. Like when you're constantly like trying to reconcile those.
Right. So with your students, obviously, they have to sit there and listen to you. And so in some ways, it's kind of like we get to set up the rhyme, the reason, the logic, and all of this, and it lends to a really nice environment to teach people about the nature of science and how we know what we know. How do you approach, though, this kind of like trying to educate people like in your community, in your ward, in your stake? I mean, I'm assuming you've served in callings where you've been teachers or leaders. I mean, do you get into this there, or do you just stay more on the sidelines there? What's your approach?
I do engage this. And I will say that like I've never ever, early on, like in graduate school, I was like, I'll fix this problem by just like telling people how it is, right? Like number of successes, 0, right? Like that doesn't work. Like the only way that I've been able to successfully bring someone closer to my way of seeing things, like somewhat closer to reconciling faith and reason, is to do it through love, right? Do it through like, look, I'm just sharing the love here. I'm not trying to shove anything down your throat. I'm not trying to like say you're wrong about, like, if they know that my only interest in doing this is because I care about them, and that I show interest. Oh, you asked me, so I'm going to tell you how I really feel about it. And when they are asking me, when they're saying, hey, will you give us a fireside? Hey, will you give a presentation to the empty nesters group? Or will you talk to our stake leaders about this particular issue? I'm like, yeah, would love to. But I always have to go in, like, not as, some kind of hardcore scientist, but as someone who really cares about them, right? So I always have to say, like, just check your motives. Like, I'll start preparing something. I'll say, why are you doing that? Why are you saying it that way? And I have to say, you know what? Yeah. If I'm doing this because I really love these people and I really, really care about them, and I really want them to see, have a broader, clearer picture, so that they can better do the Lord's work here, right? Like empower them to actually have the knowledge and the vision to take what I'm about to say to them and make the world, make their ability to serve or whatever it is that I've been asked to do better. Like when I come at it from a place of love, then it's much more effective.
Wow, I love that. Like I need to be a lot better at that.
Well, it's easy to say, really hard to do, right? When someone's like harshing on you on some Facebook post and you're like, wait, what? Like you kind of just want to say, no, you're wrong, and here's why. Like if you're like me, you can spend like an hour and a half crafting, 4 paragraphs of this very clearly explains like how you're wrong. And then their response is like, yeah, well, I don't believe it. They're like, done. Like,
they move on to the next subject.
And they just troll the next person or whatever. And it's like, okay, that's not how, that doesn't work, right? It's got to come from a place of love, or it's just not effective.
Wow, I love that. I'm going to try to be better at that.
Well, good luck.
Sunshine with me. The doors are open, the skies are too. Sunshine is coming in for me and you. Sunshine.